Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of the week right here on Dojo Live this Thursday, September 8th, 2022. My name is Kim Lantis, and it's my pleasure to be hosting today. Along with me, I have as his premier co-hosting days, Victor Garcia, who is a data scientist here at Ancora. Thank you so much for joining us, Victor.
Thank you for inviting me, Kim.
Yes, and the reason why I have Victor here as co-host is because we're speaking with Gary Hagmueller, the CEO of Arcion. And Arcion is all about change data capture, which is completely new to me and quite technical. And I said, I need a co-pilot who can help steer this. So thank you so much, Gary, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for spending your time and knowledge with us.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure, Kim. Absolutely.
Yes. So as we get started, before we talk about that change data capture or CDC a bit more in depth, let's get to know you, please, a bit better. What's your story? What's your passion, and what's kind of led up to your Arcion days?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of funny. So my background is I've probably spent 25 or so years in technology, right? Almost all of it selling things to companies. Always kind of software related sorts of stuff. The last 10 years or so was all selling, machine learning and AI sorts of applications to big banks and government agencies and insurance companies and stuff like that, right? And so, that was a really fun and interesting pursuit, right? One of the things that always kind of came up, however, which kind of stitches together the topic that we're going to talk about today, is the fact that all of these companies really had this desire to get information out of their transactional stores and as close to real time as possible to power these great applications and things that we wound up building, right? Absolutely none of them could get there, right? So the best these guys could get was like a batch job that ran like every 2 weeks or sometimes every month. And usually when somebody would run it, it would break things or whatever else. And so, when I had the opportunity to link up with Raj, our founder here, the light bulb really went off, right? That, hey, this is an interesting technology that was becoming of age, right? And, as I really got into understanding, the power that machine learning and AI could deliver for organizations, it felt just a natural opportunity to kind of link up that real-time piece of it. And so that's the background of how I wound up getting here. But, my passion in life at the end of the day is figuring stuff out, building stuff, right? Which is why these entrepreneurial things have appealed so much to me, and basically just trying to figure out how to make the world a better place, right? So that's kind of the gist of it.
Yes, thank you. And that's really why we have our show. And it's always a pleasure to learn from people like you, because the way that technology is able to impact pretty much every facet of human life and non-human life for that matter, is fascinating. And it's funny that you mentioned the real-time gap still, because from my perspective, things are pretty stinking real time. I mean, if I utilize my credit card and I've got my phone in my back pocket, I can immediately feel it like, hey, you just your account's been discounted by X amount or transaction or whatever. So I'm interested to see and where those real-time gaps are. But before we get into that, let's talk a bit more about Arcion. What is it that you do exactly? What's the problem that you're solving?
Yeah, okay. So at the end of the day, actually your reference to the credit card in your telephone is a great example of the sorts of stuff that we wind up doing. So think about the world as follows, right? There's a bunch of things that companies use to run their transactional systems, right? So the credit card example is a great one, right? When you swipe that credit card, somehow that wound up running its way through the various networks, and it wound up either impacting like an Oracle or a Sybase or one of these sorts of transactional data stores. Those things are really good at reads and writes and things like that. But they're not designed for analytical purposes or other things like that. They're basically good for just writing things into there, storing them, and making sure that there's solid integrity of the transaction.
Money went from A to B.
Yeah, and it didn't go there twice, and it didn't not go there or other things like that. That's what they're good at. You have these other things that are different types of systems that basically perform a variety of things. They could either perform analytical things, or they could perform like what you experienced when your phone alerted you to it, right? There's this, okay, it's an application, and like I'm now going to tell Kim that that transaction posted to her account, right? Those are going to be these downstream sorts of systems. Now, the fact that you're getting that on your phone means whatever company that you use probably has some form of a CDC sort of transaction running behind the scenes that links up that transactional database to the application that alerts you that a thing went out there, right? Sometimes those are kind of hardwired. Sometimes they're done in a more basic way, like a timestamp sort of way. But what Arcion does is a form of change data capture where we don't actually touch those transactional systems themselves. And there's a reason for that, right? Because if you touch them, you slow them down. That's a bad thing, right? Or you increase the security risk that like somebody who shouldn't be in the system is like, trying to do stuff on it, right? The gist of this is basically as follows, right? You want those transactional systems to be as pure as possible to do the transactional pieces, full stop. You don't want them running any other software. You don't want them running any other sort of things, right? They, however, all write into a log. Every time a transaction posts, something goes into a log. Those logs originally evolved for, troubleshooting or security profiles or whatever else, but basically they're kind of a very clean record of what went through the transactional system. That's what we touch, right? We basically become a secondary channel that not only does the log go over here for the security people to make sure that nobody's messing around with the core system, but we can take that exact same sort of feed. We listen to see, okay, is there a new transaction that has just come into the log? And if the answer is yes, then we grab that transaction and we essentially move it up the wire into those other systems that I described earlier. And those other systems could be used to do machine learning or business intelligence or build an application that alerts Kim that a transaction has just gone through the system. So that's at a super high level what we do. There's a lot of nuance to because like the transactional system could have a different format than these other systems. There's a lot of that sort of stuff which we could geek out for a long time, but at a simple level, that's essentially what the whole technology is about.
Isn't that always the case? Easier said than done. But I think this is a good transition into. I was going to say transaction. You got me saying transaction. Transition into the topic that you chose today. And the topic is change data capture's central role in carrying out core missions, and really to answer the question of why is CDC technology critical to modern enterprises and how can it be leveraged to drive transformative advantages. So I think at the very high level, we have an idea of what CDC means. And so the bigger question is why, right?
Yeah.
So why did you choose this topic for today and why is it relevant for us?
Yeah, well, it's relevant. So I chose the topic for today because it's something that I pretty much spend my entire time doing, right? So, it just kind of made sense that that'd be the perfect thing to chat about. The reason why I think it's topical, though, kind of goes back to the introductory story that I talked about with my path here, right? So at the end of the day, we're in an era right now where I would say we're going through a data modernization phase, right? That again is changing the way all of us basically interact with the systems that surround us during our lives, right? So we're entering the era I would describe right now the real-time era, right? So up until this point here, we've existed in a world where it's okay that things could wind up sitting in a transactional system for the better part of a week or two or whatever it is before moving it off into some place where I can do stuff with it, right? But those days are kind of coming to an end, right? Because they're basically that's no longer a good thing because you lose so much of the time value of a transaction if you let it sit for a couple of weeks. And let me give you a couple of examples, right? So in my past, what we would do is we would build a lot of applications that would do things, for example, like anti-money laundering, right? So the situation in a thing like that is that you want to have as much of the transactional data streaming into the system that's going to then either build or enhance the models that you use to detect when people are doing things or, when bad actors might be showing up and trying to transfer money around or other things like that, right? So keep in mind this. So if you establish a rule based on some machine learning sort of thing that says, hey, this is a bad set of transactions and so block them, right? It's not like the bad actors then say, oh, okay, well, you got me. I'm just going to sit around for the next 2 weeks and, and then I'll just, decide to do another thing. No, they're going to as soon as they're like, oh, damn it didn't work, right? They're going to then turn around and try to figure out another way to get the whole thing through. So if you miss the subtle nuances of these transactions and how they wind up evolving, you can wind up leaving a lot of valuable things on the table and the bad actors could wind up doing a lot of damage before you get your next batch of data to power that. And that's but one example, right? There's other examples too, where there's things like what Netflix is doing, right? Where let's just say you just streamed a bunch of stuff, right? And what it's doing behind the scenes is trying to figure out, okay, what is a thing that I could recommend that would be of interest to you, right? And if you don't wind up doing it um, fairly close to real time, you wind up with some pretty bad recommendations, right? Because what you were streaming 2 weeks ago might be totally different than what you're binge watching today, right? And so that's another example of this sort of stuff. And the list goes on. I mean, think about like Uber, for example, right? When you call an Uber and you're looking at your phone trying to figure out where the car is and all that sort of stuff. Well, what's happening there is you're getting CDC coming out of multiple different systems into the application that Uber is using to tell you that your ride is 2 blocks away and making a right turn, right? So that gives you a sense of the power of what wound up happening here. And without those sorts of things, imagine the experience you would have with an Uber where it just tells you, hey, it's coming, right? And then magically it's there, right? So that's not the experience that most people would want anymore, right? Most people really kind of want to know where it is and be able to figure out all of that stuff. And so that gives you hopefully a flavor of the sorts of things that you can do using the CDC sort of technology.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Even my very non-technical brain is able to wrap around this. So, Victor, let's pass it over to your very technical brain. What are you gathering from all this, and what kind of questions might you have here for Gary?
Yes, there are 2 questions. The first of all, and getting a little bit deeper on what you are doing. Well, several companies have their historical databases in their data houses with a daily backup. Maybe twice a day they have a backup. Why using CDC on the cloud? By the way, on the cloud, not instead of physical
Yep.
storage. Why using CDC? I mean, not only talking on a computational or a financial costs. Why
Yep.
CDC?
Okay, so the question, why CDC in the cloud? Is that kind of the question, and why not do some of the backup sort of stuff? Okay, so the use case. Okay, so CDC in the cloud. Let's actually take a step back. So CDC, it's not actually a new technology, right? So it's been around for a number of years, almost 20 years generally, right? I think the earliest deployments was like in the mid to late 90s sort of time frame, right? But the hallmark of a lot of the original systems themselves is you'd have to build these large systems that would sit next to the databases themselves, and they would be hard to set up, hard to manage. You'd have to like do some pretty detailed sort of coding, and then anytime that coding something changed, you'd have to go and recode the stuff, right? So there was a lot of work going to being done that way. The second thing is that the cloud unlocks a bunch of very interesting opportunities that really weren't available to folks who might have been able to do this in the past, right? So, for example, you remember earlier I talked about how you don't want to tax the source systems or the transactional record systems at all possible, right? So one example of why CDC matters in this world, and sorry, we're going to get a little technical here for just a second, right? There's this concept in a transactional system of a committed and an uncommitted transaction, right? So think about this. This is like you're creating a record in the transactional system, but you haven't written it firmly into the log yet. In fact, this is the final transaction, and that's all it. So the transactional system can support multiple states of a transaction. The analytical system on the other end cannot tolerate uncommitted transactions, right? Because this could create extraneous noise or other sorts of things in a model or an application or other things like that. So the way that a lot of other systems have dealt with it in the past is they basically ask the transactional system to run querying sort of things to say, okay, well, only when you see a committed transaction, then you send this sort of thing out, right? But now you're taxing that system. By using the cloud infrastructure that we've built, right, what we can do is we can absorb both the transactional and the committed and non-committed transactions. We can sit on the uncommitted transactions and wait for the signal that says, okay, this transaction has now been committed, and now we can pump it up to the analytical sort of system, right? So that allows the transactional system to work at peak performance, and it also allows the downstream system to make sure that it's only getting the records that it needs in order to perform the functions that it needs to do, right? So that's one aspect of it. there's a secondary aspect of it, right? So the transactional system could be in a data format or a schema that is very different than the system that winds up being the analytical thing that you're going to build your stuff on. Like, for example, you could say the transactional system could be a Mongo, right, which is a document-based sort of system, right, which looks very different than a SQL-based sort of system. And how do you deal with like all the extraneous bits that happen to be in the Mongo system, right? So by putting us in between in a cloud sort of format, we can take the Mongo bit, do the translational bit, and make sure that it winds up showing up properly in the analytical system. And finally, there's another final piece of it too, which is if somebody makes a change in the transactional system, let's say they add a new column, right, or they add something to it that didn't exist before, right? You need a process by which you detect, oh, something has changed. I now have to alert the upstream system that something has changed and make sure the upstream system can process it, right? In the olden days of just about every other CDC carrier out there, what would happen is it would say, it's all messed up. I have to go and completely rebuild from the transactional system. So think grab days, weeks, or months worth of records, right? Rebuild it in between and then shove it into the downstream system. The good news about doing it in the cloud that we've got is you don't have to do that anymore, because now what we do is we create a little buffer sort of thing that says, oh wait, new column, let's go back to figure out when the new column showed up. Got it. We're not going to go back to the transactional system and make a change. Now we just know that this new thing exists, and we can push the new thing into the downstream system in a way that the downstream system can deal with it without having to go rebuild on either end. So that, I realize this is probably deeper than most of the people watching probably want to know, but it gives you a sense of the things that you can do with the cloud piece in the middle versus having to build it, with some hardened code thing in your data center.
I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it builds a very strong case. So let me kind of catch up and make sure I'm following along here. So we've got CDC that essentially makes analytics itself much faster and much more real time, which helps close gaps for a lot of potential problems, and just creating a competitive advantage. But then you have Arcion that came along with existing CDC technology, but now we 2.0'd it, and now it's in the cloud, and it's even faster and more secure, right? And less, what might the word be, invasive, perhaps, than the way things are traditionally done.
I'd add one word to it too, and that is, look, our focus here is to basically make it ridiculously brain dead simple to have these data pipes out there. So our desire here, the company's stated desire, is like, look, at the end of the day, you don't want to have to deploy your precious resources, your data scientists, your data engineers, your software engineers, just to maintain a pipe, right? So we want to get to a place where it's really simple. We let you know if there's a problem. If we can, we'll solve the problem for you. Right. And if not, we'll tell you pretty much exactly what the problem is. So if you have to intervene yourself, you can do it. You can do it quickly and go on and do the more higher value things, like figure out, what value we can add out of that data versus how to keep the pipe flowing.
Exactly. And that kind of led me to this next question of the then what, right? So now I have access to all this amazing data in real time. What's next? How does Arcion fill in that gap, or what are your actual users doing with this?
Well, so here's the great thing about this business, Kim. The great thing is that our users discover brand new use cases almost every single day, right? Which is kind of fun, right? Because at the end of the day, our job is to get them the data. They shouldn't have to figure out where the data is coming from and all of that stuff. They should just say, hey, I want to go build this thing on this platform over here, and I'd like the data to come to me. So ideally, the data should come to them as a service in the way that I just described, where it's super brain dead simple and like, okay, it just shows up and it's, I understand all the facets of it. I understand what the columns mean and things like that. So now I can build, some great machine learning application or some new, alerting thing, to use your example from earlier, that's going to add value to my business or my customers or what have you, right? So the use cases, my general sense here is I could probably tick off, maybe 10 or 15 sorts of use cases, but the truth is going to be over the next 5-10 years, it'll probably be almost infinite, because as I said earlier, right, we're getting to a state where, we're entering the true real-time era, right? Things around you will kind of understand all that's going on in your daily world. And alert you as to, hey, you should be doing this, or maybe you should do that, or like maybe there's this thing over here that you should get out to. And so I think we're entering a place where people will figure out a whole bunch of new and interesting ways to do stuff. And, I'm just happy that we're in a position that we can help power that.
That's amazing. So it's basically like the supermarket of data. Like, wouldn't it be nice if I knew and then,
That's kind of right. Yeah. I think that's kind of right. Look, the way we talk about it is internally, we talk about it as data as a service at the end of the day, right? If you think about it that way. But it is kind of what you talked about, which is kind of the supermarket where, like, I want a can of this and I want some, some lettuce and, whatever else. And so you go and, you know what aisle it's in, you just go over to that aisle, you grab it, you put it in your cart, and, you go make yourself a great dinner, right? And so that's essentially what we're hoping to empower for companies.
And then to your point of maybe even accessing things that I didn't even think to access before. Like, let's stay with my supermarket analogy here of, a friend like, hey, I made this amazing dish yesterday, or have you ever tried fill in the blank? And no, I haven't. So let me do that too. And is there a community component that can be an offshoot of this, or do you have different users, different help creating the possibilities?
So not yet. So right now, so the interesting thing is, we're still growing and growing quickly. Our customers are the ones who are basically driving the creativity, and every day somebody shows up with some new and interesting way to do stuff. So that's kind of our community. I think there's certainly a community opportunity down the road. I think as we start to evolve our offering to, and Victor will appreciate this. A lot of times when you're building, a machine learning model or things like that, it's this iterative process where you grab some data and you thought you got all the data, and then your model returns some weird stuff, or not a complete analysis, and you're like, oh crap, I have to go back and grab some more things and things like that, right? And basically, that's a world where we can help provide, hey, like every time a transaction happens, these 5 tables are always updated. So get all the entries from those 5 tables instead of having to go back and figure out that, oh, okay, I've missed a table or 2 down the road, right? And so that's an area where there's certainly going to be additional community input coming into the equation, which is figuring out how to make what we call that intuition piece of what we're doing, more robust and more performant for the folks who need to build things.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think as we're coming to the final few minutes of our show, if you can believe it, it's that time already. Victor, I think you do have, and certainly does. You think a half hour is a long time to talk, and it really, really is not, especially if you can talk a lot like me. So Victor, I think you have another question for Gary?
Yeah, that's right. You were talking before about the Uber example and having this real-time information. And as you could see below the Gary's LinkedIn, I could see that you were a CFO sometimes before your current position. The question is, would you say that Arcion would be the solution for the daily problems that you have as a CFO, that something that would help you in the past?
Yeah, it can be. So there's 2 flavors of things that CFOs are going to wind up looking at. One is going to be kind of a business intelligence thing. All right, so let me see how many widgets I sold yesterday and what was my gross margin and things like that. Could we help in that? Yeah, we could, but maybe it's not going to be the highest value, right? Because things won't change at a corporate level that fast. Now, the security related things, right? Or, if you're like in my past, like, all the IT reported up to me, and, facilities reported up to me and other things like that. So the security related sorts of things and alerting me that, like, oh, something has just happened, right, in your systems, and you need to know about this sort of stuff and take action, that absolutely shows up as that. If you are running the sort of business, let's say you're having a sale, right, and you're trying to maximize your margin or whatever else, and your online transactions are working in a certain way, and suddenly you're realizing, oh crap, our the low margin thing is selling more than the high margin thing. I could see a world where, we then pass back information to whoever's running the sale on site, saying like, hey, like, increase the price on this or decrease the price on that or whatever else, to try to influence what the outcome of the sale would wind up being. I could see a circumstance like that as being something that you could build. But it really does go back to the individual business, and if there's a use case that you could take action, and it really, that's the key, right? If you can take some kind of an action, based on real time that benefits you, that's, doesn't matter if you're CFO or sales guy or, engineering person or whatever it is, right? That's essentially what we're trying to drive at.
Beautiful. And it's interesting, bringing back kind of your personal history, your CFO days, your CEO days, and everything that implies. Let's talk a bit more now, these final few minutes, about Arcion and just the company culture that you've been building, that you're looking to build, the people who help you create it. What's it like to work at Arcion?
Yeah, well, I think it's great. And so, look, the culture we're trying to build is largely a couple things, right? So I've spent too long in technology here to understand anything other than the fact that, like, to recruit the best people and to get teams that are highly performant and that sort of stuff, you have to treat them like adults, right? And you have to be seriously honest with them, right? And so what I like to do is practice what I describe as kind of like a radical transparency sort of thing, and that is basically like we tell people pretty much what's going on, and we're honest with them, right? You don't try to hide stuff, you don't try to, like, fudge your way through or whatever else. And when people ask you questions during all hands or whatever else that sometimes aren't the most comfortable to answer, you answer them, right? And like what that does is it creates a culture of trust, and it buys people into the mission that you're on, right? Because these are, it's not easy to build a technology company at the end of the day, right? There are long hours. There's lots of highs, and then there's also lots of lows, right? Because their variability in these sorts of organizations is quite great, right? And so by buying people into the mission and making them feel good about what they're doing and understanding, they don't have to always agree, right? There's like almost nothing in human kind where, like, everybody's always in agreement all the time, right? You have to get to a place where you're like, all right, I get why we're doing this, don't love it, but fine, we're gonna go do this.
Yeah, right? I don't agree, but I'll get on board.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And then, but also, by the way, like, you encourage the input, right? So that people realize, hey, and here's why I don't agree. I'm going to speak my piece. I'll be fine when it's done, but, at least I want to be heard that this is why, why I feel the way I feel.
Which is why I think you can get on board even when you don't may not agree.
That's exactly, so you've just nailed it, right? And so, like, this is all an exercise in making sure that people kind of understand the world that they're in, and feel comfortable that we're moving forward in the most prudent, and thoughtful way possible, right? So that's basically what we do, and then we try to, like, have as much fun as possible, right? I mean, at the end of the day, look, I like an open environment where, I like to use humor as kind of like a tension breaker or other things like that, right? And I'm looking for people who are kind of similarly constructed, right? I want to make sure that people, have they have that transparency. They've got a lightness of being, right? It's not always serious all the time, right? And we all generally come from the perspective that life is just too short to, like, knock yourself out, 24/7. You got to have some fun, right? And so that we try to do that as much as possible.
So let Arcion knock it out 24/7 in real time.
Yeah,
you don't have to.
Right. We'll let the systems do that. We're not going to do that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for spending your time, your wisdom with us. And with that, it's my final question. What advice out there would you have for leaders like yourself? Perhaps one thing aside from the company culture and the trust element that you've built that you would encourage them all to get on board with, and maybe something that maybe you should not do.
I've probably got too long a list of the should not do sort of stuff. So I guess the what I would advise leaders around it. Well, I guess it kind of pertains to the technology business piece of it, right? Look, I think this whole concept of what I would describe as kind of creative destruction is a really important thing as well, right? And you can't hold on to things too dearly, right? You have to kind of basically get to a point where you try things, right? And you make decisions relatively quickly that, hey, that thing that we just tried, it's not working out, right? So instead of, like, doubling down and trying to force it to work, which frequently it didn't work for a reason, right? You probably need to think about jettisoning it, learning your lessons, harvesting what you can out of it, but, move on as quickly as possible. And in that way, by the way, people will look around you and they will adopt that same sort of thing as well, right? They will say, like, I'm going to experiment. It's okay if the experiment doesn't go perfectly. We're going to learn our lessons, but we're also going to cut our losses before we invest too deeply, because as soon as you invest too deeply in something, it's human nature that you can't pull yourself out of that. So that's, like, probably one of the most important things beyond company culture that I generally counsel people, certainly in the technology industry, right?
Thank you. It's words to live by for sure. Thank you so much again for your time. Wishing you
Awesome.
and Arcion nothing but success. Hold on just a minute as we go off air. But before we do, I would like to remind our viewers that we have our recap show coming up on Monday morning, 10 o'clock Pacific, where we will talk about Gary's show as well as the other two shows that we had this week and introduce you to the amazing shows that we'll be having next week. So until then, stay safe, everyone. And Victor, thank you so much for joining us, your insight, and hopefully this conversation was insightful for you as well.
Awesome.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks, Kim. Have yourselves a great weekend, all right?
You too. Bye for now.
Okay. Bye.